LegalizeFreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Beyond politics, poverty, and war. LegalizeFreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and today we present part 2 of our interview with Jim Elvidge, who joins us to discuss his book, Digital Consciousness, A Transformative Vision. If you haven't yet heard part 1, you can find it at LegalizeFreedom.com, that's legalize-freedom.com, and you can spell legalize with an S or a Z. The interview resumes as we discuss the potential similarities between the fundamental nature of reality and a computer game scenario. Okay, well, a little while ago you mentioned reality as computer game analogy. I know some people feel that that's a bit overused or simplistic, but actually in the sections of the book where you talk about quantum physics, you begin to see how when people are looking at quantum phenomena and trying to say, well, why does that happen? And how can we tie that in with the reality that we experience, that the mechanisms and sort of behaviors at the quantum level start to suggest or start to show how something like a computer game analogy might actually be very useful and maybe why it has endured. For example, the observer effect that people will be familiar with if they looked at even basic quantum physics, that the act of observation locks in the position of a particle, and until that point, it's indeterminate. And this is a lot like the quote from your book, the phrase that you use is reality as needed. And this also gives rise to the idea of, like, you know, if a tree falls over in the woods and no one's there to hear it, does it make a sound, sort of thing? Well, the suggestion would be probably not. And I remember in the 1980s, my first ever home computer was a Commodore 64. I don't know if you remember those.
Oh, I do, yes.
So pretty sludgy in terms of processing power, but it was one of the best available at the time for the domestic market. And there was one game I remember, I don't remember what the hell it was, but you were exploring a virtual reality. It looked kind of like a bargain basement version of Tron or something like that. And you wandered around this landscape, and I clearly remember at certain times you would turn a corner in this landscape and you would see whatever structure was in front of you just suddenly quickly being finished. You know, maybe a pyramid or something. It's like, oh, I just saw the last bit of that pyramid going into place. So basically it wasn't there until I turned the corner, if you see what I mean, until I'd observed it. And when I read the phrase in your book, reality is needed, and started to think about the quantum analogies for what we actually experience, it started to make a lot of sense. And some of the phenomena that I mentioned earlier, the anomalous phenomena, if you think about it, some of these things that we experience in the world that are very strange and would fall under the realms of paranormal or supernatural begin to suggest a reality is needed model. Something like all of this stuff isn't here, if you see what I mean, in the sense that we think it is.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm wondering if the game you're talking about is Quake, or there's another one called Doom, I think, that were like that. You could just kind of wander around all over the place. Now, there are kind of two possibilities there with those early computers. One could be that all of that stuff was actually constructed and was loaded into your memory, and your computer memory. But as you move to a different room, because your computer memory is limited, it has to pull in some more data from somewhere to, for that room or for the next, set of rooms that you're walking through. And it takes a little while then to render that on the screen. That's one model. And you could argue there that the problem is just sort of a caching or keeping up with it. But then there's another idea that, and this, we've definitely built computer systems and games that follow this, where there is no fixed construct. I forget the name of it. There's one game now where you can go out and kind of explore the universe, and it creates it as you go. So in that case, it is exactly what we're talking about, this dynamic reality generation thing. As you go, the system keeps up with you and creates something new. Every single person has a different experience in that game, and that's really cool. Well, so what does that mean about our current reality? And I've used this analogy before. If you're in a video game and you come across a room that has a door, but you can't open the door, it's locked, and it has no windows, does the game have to design what's inside the room? No, it doesn't. In fact, it would probably be computationally inefficient to do so. But now, as soon as you find the key to open the door, now it makes sense to, just in time, create what's inside that room. That's a very efficient way to run a very high level, all-encompassing kind of game or simulation like that, is to create things as you need them. Well, that is exactly what seems to happen in these quantum experiments. There's even one called the delayed choice quantum eraser experiment that takes out the possibility that your detector is somehow influencing the results. And basically, what happens is there's a screen that these particles are shot at, and when there's an interference pattern on the screen, it means that you don't know which slot the particles went through. So it's indeterminate at that point. The detection of which slot they went through occurs after they've hit the screen. And when that detection is done, the interference pattern disappears, because in order for this experiment to be complete, now that the detection has done, you go back in time, the interference pattern disappears, and now you know which slot the particles went through. There are two different directions they could have gone. So it's almost like a, reverse causality thing. Something's happened after, the experience later. And it baffles people because of this reverse causality idea, but it doesn't baffle you if you realize that you didn't have to have a path. These particles didn't have to have a path until it was needed. And what does that mean? Does it mean needed because somebody is now observing it? There's a human consciousness in there, trying to figure out which path they went through? Or was it needed because the experiment had a detector there that had to record something and store it away, and so now there was a reason for the path to be created? You see, either way, it's exactly the same analogy as that dynamic reality generation that we talked about before, that we didn't need to create it until it was needed. So it's not like that fixed, objective, deterministic reality is sitting out there waiting for us to discover it. That's absolutely not what's going on. It unfolds as we discover it. And that's the big learning out of these experiments.
Well, if we consider a couple of the explanations that are offered by the digital consciousness model, probably the headline one would be the phenomena that we've talked about extensively so far, anything that would fall under the banner of paranormal, supernatural, psychic phenomena. These things not only become possible under this model, but sort of inevitable, really. I think the phrase you use in the book is accessing data streams, or it's something very similar, which is basically all of these, if we just use the rubric of psychic phenomena, all these things that appear unexplainable, when you consider that you're reaching beyond the narrow limits of our 5-sense 3D reality to access information, we're scanning the matrix, then it's not such a mystery. It doesn't mean that it's easy to do, but it means that it can be done, whether you learn to do it, whether you can intuitively do it, whether it sometimes happens by accident. It's just leakage coming in from a wider sphere, really. I remember, again, another thought that popped into my head when I was reading your book, and it's funny how many references there are to things in popular culture that come to when I'm talking about these subjects. Again, I think it's just that another way for this information to get out to people through non-mainstream news or science journals or whatever. There's a 1995 film by Michael Mann called Heat. It's basically about the fortunes of some armed bank robbers. And one of the associates of the gang has got some information for them about how much money is going to be in a certain bank at a certain time. And this is pre-internet. It would show you guys want to go into this bank on this day. There's going to be millions. And so one of the robbers says, how did you get this information? And he replies, it just comes to you. This stuff just flies through the air. It's just beamed out, it's just beamed out all over the place. You just have to grab it. And I know how to grab it. And that, it was like, in another century, in another millennia, he might have been considered psychic. How did you know these things? Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I love that. That's a perfect analogy. Yeah, I kind of think of it this way. I think in the bigger reality, there is probably a recording of everything that's going on, essentially. You know, some people have used the term Akashic record. It's a similar concept. So everything I'm thinking, everything that I do, every experience that I have, it's once it's experienced, it's kind of stored out there. So that means that anybody else theoretically could access it, but not unless they're separate from their brain, right? If our consciousness is out there and you're storing this stuff out there in the greater reality, then other consciousnesses could theoretically get to it. Now, I think there's probably some kind of, I don't know, like soft rules about keeping a lot of this information from everybody, because if you realize how soft everything is, you then take the lessons that you're learning in this world and in this lifetime a little bit less seriously. And I think the value of the consensus reality and the experience that we're having that feels hard and fixed is that we take it seriously. And so, whatever we learn, however we evolve, we learn to be more patient, we learn to love or whatever, we take those things seriously, and those things are what's evolving our consciousness. If we didn't have that separation of all the other stuff, we might not take it as seriously. So I think there's a point to it. But obviously it's a little bit leaky because people do experience these things. And as you mentioned earlier, why the leak? The leak has probably given us the hints, and the hints is what keeps us thinking and keeps us investigating. I have a belief that all the stuff is out there, and remote viewing experiments kind of bear this out too. It's out there, but you can't get to it because you're busy dealing with the monkey chatter that's going inside your head. What am I having for dinner? What did I do yesterday? Recalling a significant conversation you had. What am I going to do tomorrow? Who do I need to call? What do I need to do? All these kind of things are going around in your head all the time. And so that's occupying your conscious thoughts. You don't have the ability to dig down deeper unless you do something about that. And that's what meditation is all about. Meditation is about clearing out that monkey chatter so that now your awareness is free to go somewhere else. It doesn't have to be in this reality anymore. It can go back to where the seat of your consciousness is, which is why when people meditate or, have experiences with kind of ritualistic drums or dancing or something like that they tap into some greater truths and they have these spiritual experiences. It's because they're able to both focus and let go of the monkey chatter at the same time. And that gives us the access to this other stuff.
Now, as you mentioned in the book, when you're looking at the overall digital consciousness model, the simulation, whatever you want to call it, you point out that it's not an infinite system. And we talked earlier about it, efficiencies within it, just doing what it can with the adequate resources, but not excess resources because there's no need. Now, your theory offers actually origin of life explanation, which is amazing in itself. But I wonder, I suppose it can't really get past or circumvent the origin theory event horizon. That is to say, you mentioned Tom Campbell earlier. There's a point beyond which we cannot see. And in his work, he takes that as a given and an accepted thing. Okay, I get that. I can't keep going back and back and back, layers and layers of the onion, as it were, because the fundamental question for me when I finished considering your idea is, well, what's behind this? So I'm guessing that you accept there's just a point beyond which we will not go in order that we can actually move forward in some way of exploring these ideas. Because if you just take what's the ultimate, the alpha point, the underlying strata, is there anything beyond that? It's a bit like, when you're a kid, if you ever considered the edge of the universe, if it ends and what's beyond it. I used to spend hours thinking about that.
Yeah. Yeah. I try to avoid that a little bit. Like, it's fun to speculate about it. And, you could write a book about speculating what's unknowable, speculating about what's unknowable. But then that's also called, it could be called fiction or science fiction or philosophy or whatever. It's not what really my focus in this is. Really things that are closer to the experience realm. Now, that's just me. That's just my experience. Tom, you mentioned Dom Campbell. He told me that he's had thousands of hours of experiences outside of this physical reality. So he's somebody who's coming from this with a different point of view. I've had a little bit, not a lot, but he's had a ton of experiences outside of this. So he can write things based on the knowledge that he gained from interacting with others in that realm, that I can't really. I'm just saying, in terms of like what's behind this and how did it start and all that, I kind of referenced, one of his ideas in the book. And I think it's a cool idea because I think it explains where things are at now. I think it's a good, definitely good. And maybe that's the right thing. To me, it's kind of unknowable because I just haven't been there. And I think that's, that's okay. But, we all have our own set of things that we've had experiences for and beliefs based on those and so forth. And I think the interesting thing is if you take Tom's experience and Robert Monroe's experience and Edgar Cayce's experience and the Buddha's experience and Muhammad's experience and, the spiritual experiences, the otherworldly out-of-body experiences that mystics and meditators and astral travelers and all those kinds of people have had, there's really a lot of very similar threads to them. And that to me is also profound. I mean, you could say, well, they're similar because they're based on the same thing. They're based on, say, Buddhist teaching, which everybody has had. But I think if you actually look at the bigger picture, you realize that there were ancient wisdoms that built up where there was no correlation between them. There was no cause and effect, or there was nothing that came first. They just built up independently. Or, people like Edgar Cayce had no knowledge of these things and wrote stuff down. There are people in Brian Weiss's book about past life regressions who had no experience with understanding what the ancient wisdoms were, and yet they reported the same things when they experienced the in-between world in between their lives, that, we're all connected, we have a purpose, material things have no meaning or lasting value, we can, control our destiny, the world's illusory, love is the way, all these kinds of things they're not, it doesn't make sense that they would all be identical in all of these experiences where, people have no grounds for making them identical.
Another major question here then is, was the universe, the reality learning lab, the digital consciousness, however you want to express it, designed for life, or did it evolve that way? That is to say, is there a creator behind it? Again, what some traditions refer to as God, a sort of matrix architect, and it's some sort of intelligent entity that set this running, or is it an evolving thing? And as some people have theorized, that we may be part or perhaps all of the consciousness of the universe, where the universe becoming aware of itself, that there isn't actually, the consciousness is an evolving thing, awareness is an evolving thing, and we're it.
Yeah, and I tend to go that way, and again, I go that way because of the experiences that people have had in these other realms and what they've said and the sort of confluence of points that they've had. You could argue there's an entity out there, like a machine or an alien or something like that created this whole world for us, but it doesn't explain why we would have the spiritual experiences or the near-death experiences or precognition or things like that. It doesn't explain that very well. So I do tend to, fall in that side of things, that there's not a anthropomorphized God that created this stuff. It's more like the bigger system is all that there is. And again, when you read ancient religions, Hinduism, Sikhism, Buddhism, they, that's what they say too. God is all that there is. God isn't a guy with a white beard, who has human emotions. In fact, in Tom Campbell's point of view, all that there is kind of dispassionate. It has an objective to evolve in some way, in that evolution he calls lowering of entropy, becoming compassionate and so forth. That is also consistent with ancient wisdoms. So it has that direction, but the way that it goes about it, it could be trying different things. It could be constantly feeding back on itself and saying, is this working? Are they ready for this? Should we try this? Did this experiment over here work? No, let's not do that again. Let's try something different. That's sort of the fundamental continuous improvement idea. And that really seems like that's what's going on. I think that human evolution is something that's happening. I think that we're part of that. We're part of that because we have free will. And so as things unfold, we're ready to be shown the next level. We're shown the next level. We explore that. We get new experiences there. And I think, so I think it does tend to show that the God, if you will, the force behind it is not a particular individual. It's more a continuously evolving concept. It doesn't take anything away from the spirituality of it. If you want to say that becoming one with God is important to you, there's a place for that. You're already part of all that there is. So therefore, you're already part of God. You're just spending a lot of your time in this reality learning lab, and maybe at some point you decide you don't want to do that anymore, and now you're outside of it. That's the nirvana concept, or getting being finished with the cycle of physical incarnations, kind of thing.
Yeah, and what you've just set out, that allows for good and evil. This dispassionate system, as you describe it, allows for those things because it's probing and testing and trying things out. Because people often ask about, they ponder the existence of evil in the world and they question our nature and the possibility of God. And I think that what you've set out answers that.
Yeah, I do too. And good and evil, they're human concepts. If you also think about that, we don't, it's funny, there was just reminded me of one scene in one of the Matrix movies where the architect said, we had a simulation that was too perfect, and so, I don't know, where people didn't evolve or something like that. We learn from pain and from failures and things like that. We don't learn from doing the same thing over and over again. We kind of maybe dig a groove into our brain a little bit deeper, or into our consciousness a little bit deeper of, this is how you do things. Just keep on doing that. But that doesn't evolve us in any way at all. We evolve our thinking by solving problems or trying things and failing. And the failing can come in the term of pain. So the word evil is, again, it's a human concept. And it's because of free will decisions that are made by conscious entities out there, us, and we have to deal with them, and we have to learn from them, and figure out how to move on beyond that. So it's our own choosing. It's not that the system is bad, or that God is bad and has this set of evil out there, or that there's a evil twin, Satan or something like that. It's that we are creating what we consider to be bad.
Well, many people currently will feel that we're in the midst of some sort of existential crisis, that we're, as a species, we're going backwards. Though, again, you could look back at the course of human history and say that it's been a case of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But to be optimistic, you point out in the book that you feel there can be no apocalyptic event as such. This is a system that's geared for optimization, continual improvement, and if it is 1 step back, that'll still at some point there'll be steps forward. And it's all learning and probing and testing and seeing what works and what doesn't. And to use the computer game analogy again, you talk about a reset point, which we all are familiar with in our computers. If something goes wrong, you can go back to an earlier stage, return to a point prior to the problem, as it were. Not saying that's how things would actually work, but especially for people who feel that we're on a one-way ride to hell, basically, as it were, and that there's whatever lies in our future, it's some form of bad, that the digital consciousness perspective really reframes all of that, especially when taken in the light of what we just said about good and evil.
Yeah, it does. And to be honest, Greg, my thinking is definitely evolving as time goes on. I'm working on an article right now about evolving mind and thinking about apocalyptic events and the singularity that the transhumanists talk about, and what that could mean in a digital consciousness model. And, so I'm not discounting the possibility that there could be an apocalyptic event that would cause a reset of sorts, or a, patch upgrade to the reality learning lab or something like that. That definitely is possible, and I think I need to think that through a lot more. However, that said, history has shown that we've always, for many periods in our recent history at least, there have been a lot of people who have felt that we were on an apocalyptic path. For example, the Industrial Revolution, there was a sector of thinkers that this was, causing the end of humanity, and they pointed to reasons why, and it didn't happen. At least it hasn't happened yet. Same thing with nuclear Armageddon. The doomsday clock was 2 seconds to midnight back in the 60s, and it just seemed like such a bleak outlook for future that you have all these nukes all over the place, and somebody at some point is going to use one, and then all hell's going to break loose, and it hasn't happened. Population explosion was a big fear in the 70s. People were writing articles about how we're going to run out of food in 20 years, or then there was the energy crisis. We're going to run out of oil in 20 years, and we're not ready for that. Now it's global warming, and I'm not saying that these things aren't important things to look at, but it does seem like these are the 1 step back that you talked about against the 2 step forwards that we seem to keep on having. If you look at the broader trend, if you kind of filter out the dips, the ups and downs, and look at the broader trend, it does feel like humanity is evolving in their thought process. And just a couple examples I'd give here is just looking at murder rates. There was a book I read, Freakonomics, I think, where they talked about the murder rates in the Middle Ages in Europe and comparing them today, and the trend has been, progressively declining. People are more respectful of other people's lives. It could be because they, feel a greater connection to other people, and they are empathetic to other people's situations much more than they used to be. That's an evolutionary aspect to our thinking. And then the way we treat animals too. We treat animals as our own, as our property, for many years, ever since the agricultural revolution. Now we're starting to not do that as much. I think there was, a European country, maybe one of the Scandinavian countries that recently, declared that animals were not meant to be kept in captivity, or it was something similar to that. But there are continuous, breakdowns of that idea and recognition that animal consciousness is something significant that is no more or less important than human consciousness, and we ought to treat it that way. And I think that's an evolution in thinking. And in my view, all that there is has done by broken itself up into individuated consciousnesses and giving those individuated consciousness the directive to evolve, makes it evolve itself faster. Effectively, let's use the word God again. God is evolving faster because all of those parts of God are evolving faster. So it isn't just us out there, but there's the consciousnesses of the dogs and the cows and the fish and the fleas that are also out there in all that there is, also evolving. And if you look at it that way, then you have to have more respect for your fellow conscious entities that aren't human. So I think there's a couple examples of where I think our thinking, our general mentality is evolving. There are some where maybe it's not, but those are some. I think the greater trend has been positive. Now, the coming singularity, that's a big question mark, but it could be just another one of these things like the population explosion that predicts the end of the world. Now AI is the thing that's going to be the end of the world, and maybe something's going to happen. One of the things I'm exploring is we tend to think that AI is going to outpace humans because, why do we think that? We think that because our brains are fixed, but that's the wrong thinking. Our mind isn't just in our brain. We don't necessarily have to, evolve only due to the construct of the brain. I mean, think of how television programming, movies have gotten better, even though the TV is still projecting the same thing, if you see what I mean. So our consciousnesses out there could possibly evolve just as fast as the AI that we're creating in the Reality Learning Lab. And I'm not sure that it'll necessarily outpace us then. So maybe that's the way the apocalyptic event of the singularity will be avoided. I don't know. This is very early in speculative thinking, but just kind of wanted to address those things that you brought up.
No. And speaking about the transhumanist agenda is very important, actually, in this context. That the idea, the fear, however you want to express it, is that AI will, quote unquote, develop consciousness, or possibly that we will be able to transfer our own individual consciousness to a machine in some way to outlast, the physical human body. And I just think all of that misunderstands consciousness, really. If consciousness is the ground of reality, that, we're part of it, individuated units of it, then no AI system embedded in that can develop consciousness. It's just, if you see what I mean, because it's within it already. So, and you said, basically in your book, you say we don't need to fear Skynet, Skynet being the supercomputer in the Terminator films. But it doesn't mean that some kind of intelligent, automated, computerized machine or system couldn't wreak havoc in our reality. It certainly could, but it's the idea that popularized by transhumanists, or some of the ideas anyway. I just think that they misunderstand consciousness, and that I don't think it's an existential threat to us.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think about the theory, the thinking that they have is based on the idea that it's over when we die. That's why they want to upload consciousness so they can be immortal. What if you know you're already immortal? What if you know your consciousness is already immortal? Then that takes away that whole argument. The whole need to upload your consciousness into silicon or merge with machines so that you can become immortal and conquer the universe or whatever. It doesn't make any sense anymore. We're already going through that cycle of evolving our consciousness. And I don't even want to say the word immortal because who knows? Maybe in the greater picture, at some point, the system reshapes itself. All that there is reshapes itself, and our consciousness dissolves, and a new one is formed. I don't know. I could leave that possibility open, but that's totally at a different level than the way the transhumanists are thinking. They're thinking, from the materialist standpoint that, hey, if I want to be immortal, I got to get myself, my consciousness loaded up into silicon somewhere. One of the, and as I mentioned, the flaw with that is assuming that you're not already immortal, and that would completely change the motivation behind that. That said, the question is, could a human consciousness occupy an artificial intelligence, or occupy the construct behind an artificial intelligence? And that is possible to me. Like, imagine your consciousness is out there saying, okay, I'm attached to this avatar, this human avatar that is basically a set of information and rules in the reality learning lab, and I'm having my experiences there. But I want to see what it's like to be a robot. So I'm going to attach my consciousness to that robot entity there. You're going to find right now that it's pretty boring, because the robots are very deterministic things. AIs right now are not solving complex problems. They're solving very deterministic, simple problems still. So I don't think you'd have much of an experience in occupying that. However, if it ever gets to the point where a silicon-based construct, which again is just an information vessel in the reality learning lab, just like a human being is, if it ever gets complex enough where it could have the rich experience that you're having as a biological being in this reality learning lab, then maybe your consciousness says, hey, I'm going to try that out. So that could be the mechanism where AI becomes sentient, but it's not that it became sentient as an emergent property of the programming itself. It became sentient because a consciousness out there decided to occupy it. Does that make sense? I mean, I could see that as a possibility.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I think you're right on that. That totally makes sense. I know there's sort of things yet to be determined, and we don't quite know what turn technology might take, but that seems like a more consistent and logical line of thinking to take than some of them out there. Well, Jim, as we draw things to a close for today, I'll just offer a closing thought regarding the implications of the digital consciousness model. And whatever the state of the world happens to be right now, many people feeling a sense of dread and simultaneously emptiness and meaninglessness. This paradigm that you're offering up, whatever is going on around us, it suggests this overarching purpose, and it can really change the way that we experience our current reality. And we begin to understand that the good and evil we talked about before, bad things happen, but if there's a thrust and a direction to all of this, that maybe that can help us to reframe how we think about our lives and about the wider reality, and also to make some positive changes. If this is an evolutionary process, and it doesn't have to have any spiritual or religious overtones, unless we want to put them there, but that maybe we understand that if we change how that we live in this interconnected reality, that can have an effect on the overall direction of travel. And the popular ways of expressing some of these ideas are those of like karma, for example, that actions have consequences. And it's just something to take on board and maybe meditate upon as people go forward.
Yeah, I very much agree, Greg. It's a great way to end this, because you could ask the question, oh, this all sounds interesting, but so what? What does that mean to me? Well, it can mean a lot if you recognize it. If, we talked about the transhumanists, the humanity plus idea may be misdirected if you realize that, you're already immortal. You don't need to worry so much about, squeezing that extra 5 years out of your life, in a painful way. Enjoy life as it exists. Spend more money on curing diseases rather than life extension. You realize that there's a purpose, then you'll start treating people differently. And if you realize that we're all really connected, then it doesn't make sense for us to be in competition for resources that are part of a a learning system. Wars don't even make sense anymore. Geographical boundaries don't make that much sense. The feeling of hopelessness is a belief trap. It's a belief that things aren't going to get better, but you're actually in control of your beliefs if you recognize that your consciousness is external to your mind. You can get out of that belief trap through the power of intent. And so I think there's a lot of good positive messages in this idea that can lead to a better worldview and a more harmonious existence with our other human coexistence and animals and everything else that's out there.
Well, I just want to leave folks with a quote from your book, which it resonated particularly with me, and that is, "As soon as one door closes, another opens, almost as if the universe wants to be understood." Jim, today we've been talking about your new book. It's called Digital Consciousness, A Transformative Vision. That's available everywhere. Perhaps you'd just like to tell listeners about your website and anything you might be working on or anything else you'd like to share.
Sure. Thanks for that opportunity. The website is theuniversesolved.com, which was named after the first book, and I didn't create a second site just for this book, so that first one has everything. And basically, there's a little bit about some of the digital philosophers on there. My blog you can connect to from there, and I've posted, 80 or so different articles about all of these ideas. So there's more information there. I try to link to other people who have similar ideas. And there's a forum where people can interact and talk about their experiences. Unfortunately, right now the forum's down because I just converted, or had my internet service provider convert the site over to secure SSL, and it broke the forum. So I'm waiting for them to try to fix that, or figure out if I can fix it myself. But that's also a good place for people to just interact and talk about some of this stuff. So yeah, the book's available, pretty much everywhere. Amazon, Barnes & Noble. If it's not in a bookstore, bookstores have it in the database, so they can always order it. And, some independent bookstores may be carrying it as well. There's a Kindle version and the softcover version, both available.
Splendid. Well, Jim, once again, thank you so much for joining us today on LegalizeFreedom.com.
And thank you very much, Greg. Always great to talk to you. So look forward to the next time.